The sight that greeted Tessa when she walked to her car that Tuesday morning made her blood run cold. A man was slumped over the steering wheel of a black Mercedes, completely still. The car was parked crooked across two spaces in her apartment building's lot, and she could see through the window that his face was pale, almost gray. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the vehicle. What if he was dead? What if someone had been murdered right outside her home? Her hands shook as she pressed her face against the passenger window, trying to get a better look. Then she saw his chest rise and fall slightly. He was breathing, but something was very wrong. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his dark hair messy, and there was something about the way he was positioned that looked unnatural, like he had collapsed rather than fallen asleep. Tessa's mind raced through possibilities. Drug overdose? Heart attack? She fumbled for her phone, ready to call 911, when the man stirred slightly. His head turned just enough for her to see his profile, and her breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. Those sharp cheekbones, that strong jaw, even the mess of dark brown hair. This was Blake Richardson, the man she had helped home just 2 weeks ago from Romano's diner. The drunk millionaire who had stumbled into her life for one night and then disappeared back into his world of money and privilege. But seeing him like this, unconscious and vulnerable in his car outside her apartment, sent waves of panic through her. What was he doing here? How did he even know where she lived? And most importantly, what was wrong with him? She knocked gently on the window. Blake? Blake, can you hear me? No response. His breathing seemed shallow, and up close she could see that his skin had an unhealthy pallor. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his lips looked almost blue. Tessa's nursing school training from years ago kicked in. She tried the car door, locked. She knocked harder on the window, calling his name louder. Still nothing. This wasn't just someone sleeping off a hangover. This was something serious. Her neighbor Mrs. Patterson was walking her small dog and noticed the commotion. Everything okay, honey? I need to call an ambulance, Tessa said, her voice tight with worry. This man needs help. As she dialed 911, her mind kept racing back to that night 2 weeks ago. Blake had been drunk then too, but this felt different. That night he had been sad, broken, but alert. Now he looked like he was barely hanging on to consciousness. The 911 operator answered, and Tessa tried to stay calm as she explained the situation. I found a man unconscious in his car outside my apartment. He's breathing but won't respond when I try to wake him up. His skin looks really pale. While she gave the operator her address and answered questions, she kept watching Blake through the window. Why was he here? The last time she had seen him, she had helped him into a taxi outside Romano's, where she worked as a waitress. He had been devastated about something, drinking away his sorrows, and she had simply been kind to him when he needed it most. Now here he was, 2 weeks later, unconscious outside her home. The coincidence felt impossible, but there was no mistaking his face. This was definitely the same man who had tipped her $300 that night and thanked her for treating him like a human being instead of just another drunk customer. The ambulance arrived within minutes, followed by a police car. Tessa stepped back as the paramedics worked to get Blake out of his car. They checked his vital signs, asked him questions he couldn't answer, and loaded him onto a stretcher. Do you know this man? One of the officers asked her. Sort of, Tessa said. I helped him get home safely a couple weeks ago when he was drunk at the restaurant where I work. But I don't know why he's here or what's wrong with him. The paramedic overheard. Looks like exhaustion and dehydration, maybe some alcohol poisoning. We need to get him to the hospital. As they loaded Blake into the ambulance, Tessa felt a strange pull to follow. She barely knew this man, but something about seeing him so helpless made her feel responsible. That night at the diner, he had seemed lost, like he needed someone to care about what happened to him. Now he was in the same state, maybe worse. The police officer took down her information and asked a few more questions about how she knew Blake. Tessa explained about the night at Romano's, how he had been drinking heavily and she had made sure he got home safely instead of driving. "That was good of you," the officer said. "A lot of people would have just minded their own business." After everyone left, Tessa stood alone in the parking lot, staring at Blake's abandoned Mercedes. Her mind was spinning with questions and worries. What had happened to him in the past 2 weeks? Why had he come to her apartment building? And most unsettling of all, what if helping him that night at the restaurant had somehow led to this moment? She realized she was running late for her morning shift at Romano's, but she couldn't stop thinking about Blake lying unconscious on that stretcher. Something told her this was just the beginning of a story that would change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. As she drove to work, Tessa couldn't shake the image of Blake's pale face through the car window. She had thought their paths would never cross again after that one night, but fate seemed to have other plans. Now she felt connected to this stranger in a way that both frightened and drew her in. She had no idea that finding Blake unconscious that morning was about to set in motion a series of events that would turn her entire world upside down. All she knew was that something deep inside her refused to let her just walk away and pretend it never happened. The most unsettling part wasn't finding him unconscious. It was the feeling that somehow, this was all meant to happen. 2 weeks earlier, Romano's diner was having one of those slow Tuesday nights where time seemed to crawl. Tessa wiped down tables that were already clean and refilled salt shakers that didn't need refilling, anything to keep busy during the dinner lull. The old diner, with its cracked vinyl booths and flickering neon sign, wasn't exactly the kind of place that attracted wealthy customers. So when Blake Richardson walked through the door at 9:30 that night, he stood out like a diamond in a pile of rocks. His expensive gray suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes probably cost more than Tessa made in a month, and everything about him screamed money. But his eyes told a different story. Tessa had been waitressing long enough to recognize the look of someone drowning their sorrows. Blake's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who was already drunk but trying to hide it. He chose a corner booth away from the other customers and slumped into the worn vinyl seat. When Tessa approached with a menu and a smile, he looked up at her with such raw pain that it made her heart ache. "What can I get you?" she asked gently. "Whiskey," he said, his voice rough. "The strongest you have." "We don't serve hard liquor here, just beer and wine. But I can recommend the coffee. It's actually pretty good." Blake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Coffee won't help tonight." Tessa studied his face. She had seen plenty of people drink away their problems, but something about this man seemed different. Desperate. Like he was balancing on the edge of something dangerous. "Maybe some food would help," she suggested. "When's the last time you ate?" "I don't remember." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Just bring me whatever beer you have. The whole bottle." Against her better judgment, Tessa brought him a beer and stayed nearby, keeping an eye on him while she served other customers. Blake drank steadily but slowly, staring out the window at the parking lot like he was watching his life fall apart. When he ordered a second beer, Tessa hesitated. "You sure about that? You look like you've already had enough tonight." "Trust me, I haven't had nearly enough." Blake's laugh was bitter. "Not nearly enough to forget what happened today." Something in his voice made Tessa sit down across from him without being invited. "You want to talk about it?" Blake looked surprised, like he wasn't used to strangers showing concern. "Why would you care?" "Because you look like you're carrying the weight of the world, and sometimes it helps to share the load with someone." For a long moment, Blake just stared at her. Tessa could see him weighing whether to trust her with whatever was eating him alive. "My father died," he said finally. 3 months ago. And today I found out he left everything to charity. Everything. The business, the house, all of it. Said I wasn't responsible enough to handle the family legacy." Tessa's heart went out to him. "I'm sorry." That must hurt terribly. The worst part is, he was right. Blake's voice cracked slightly. I wasted so many years being angry with him, fighting about stupid things. Now he's gone and I can't take any of it back. They sat in silence for a moment while Tessa processed what he had told her. She thought about her own relationship with her grandmother, the only family she had left, and how she would feel if something happened before they could resolve their differences. Maybe he left the money to charity because he knew you'd find your own way, she suggested. Maybe he wanted you to build something yourself instead of just inheriting it. Blake looked at her like she had said something profound. I never thought of it that way. Sometimes the people who love us the most push us in ways that feel cruel but are actually meant to help us grow. They talked for another hour while Blake nursed his second beer. He told her about his father's restaurant empire, how he had always felt like a disappointment, how he had been drinking too much since the funeral. Tessa shared stories about working multiple jobs to support herself and her sick grandmother, about dreams she had put on hold to take care of the people she loved. When closing time arrived, Blake was clearly in no condition to drive. His expensive car keys sat on the table between them, and Tessa could see him struggling with the decision of what to do next. You can't drive home like this, she said firmly. I'll be fine, Blake insisted, but his words were slightly slurred. No, you won't. And I won't let you hurt yourself or someone else. Tessa made a decision that surprised even her. Give me your keys. What? Give me your keys. I'm calling you a taxi and making sure you get home safely. Blake stared at her in amazement. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Because everyone deserves to have someone care about whether they make it home alive. Something shifted in Blake's expression. The pain was still there, but now there was also gratitude and something that looked like hope. Tessa called a taxi and waited with Blake until it arrived. She helped him to the car, made sure the driver had his address, and even gave the driver an extra $20 to make sure Blake made it safely to his door. Before the taxi pulled away, Blake rolled down the window. Thank you, he said, pressing a folded bundle of bills into her hand. You didn't have to do any of this. Yes, I did, Tessa replied. Take care of yourself, Blake. As the taxi disappeared into the night, Tessa looked down at the money in her hand. $300. More than she made in tips during an entire week. But it wasn't the money that stayed with her as she locked up the diner and headed home. It was the look in Blake's eyes when she had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. In that moment, she had seen past his expensive clothes and wealthy background to the broken man underneath. She had treated him like a human being who mattered, not just another customer or another rich guy with problems. That night, as Tessa fell asleep in her small apartment, she thought about Blake and hoped he would find his way through whatever darkness was consuming him. She never imagined she would see him again, let alone find him unconscious outside her building 2 weeks later. But even in her wildest dreams, she couldn't have predicted how much that one act of kindness would change both of their lives forever. The morning after finding Blake unconscious, Tessa couldn't concentrate on anything at Romano's. Every time the bell above the door chimed, she looked up expecting to see a police officer with news about Blake's condition, or maybe even Blake himself, recovered and looking for answers about what had happened. But the day passed like any other. She served coffee to construction workers, took orders from office employees on their lunch breaks, and cleaned up after families with messy toddlers. The routine tasks that usually comforted her now felt meaningless. Her mind kept drifting back to Blake's pale face through the car window. You're distracted today, noticed Rita, the other waitress working the afternoon shift. Rita had been at Romano's for 15 years and could read people like open books. Something bothering you? Just tired, Tessa lied, refilling the coffee maker for the third time that hour. The truth was, she couldn't stop worrying about Blake. She had called the hospital twice, but they wouldn't give her any information since she wasn't family. All she knew was that he had been admitted, which meant his condition was serious enough to require more than just emergency room treatment. After her shift ended, Tessa drove home to her small apartment and immediately noticed that Blake's Mercedes was gone from the parking lot. Either he had recovered enough to retrieve it, or someone else had taken care of it for him. She felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that he was apparently well enough to handle his car situation, disappointment that she might never know what had really happened or why he had been outside her building. Her apartment felt especially small and empty that evening. Tessa heated up leftover soup and tried to focus on paying bills, but her mind kept wandering. She found herself looking out her window at the parking space where Blake's car had been, wondering if she would ever see him again. The next few days fell into their familiar pattern. Tessa worked the morning shift at Romano's, came home to check on her grandmother who lived in the senior apartment complex across town, then returned to Romano's for the dinner shift. It was exhausting, but it was the only way she could afford her rent and her grandmother's medical expenses. Her grandmother, Eleanor, was 83 and suffering from diabetes that required constant monitoring. She lived independently but needed daily check-ins and help with grocery shopping and doctor appointments. Tessa was her only family, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her young shoulders. "You look tired, baby," Eleanor observed when Tessa stopped by Thursday evening with groceries and medication. "You working too hard again?" "I'm fine, Grandma. Just been a busy week at the restaurant." Eleanor studied her granddaughter's face with eyes that had seen 8 decades of life. "Something else is bothering you. You got that same look you had when you were little and trying to hide something from me." Tessa smiled despite her worry. Her grandmother had always been able to see right through her. "There was this man at the restaurant a couple weeks ago. I helped him get home safely when he was drunk. Then I found him unconscious in our parking lot Tuesday morning." "Unconscious? Was he hurt?" "I don't know. The ambulance took him to the hospital, but they won't tell me anything since I'm not family. I keep thinking about him, wondering if he's okay." Eleanor reached over and patted Tessa's hand. "You got a kind heart, just like your mama did. Sometimes that kindness comes back to you in ways you don't expect. I just hope he's all right. He seemed so lost that night at the restaurant. Like he didn't have anyone who cared about him." "Well, he had you caring about him. That might have meant more than you realize." Friday at Romano's was busier than usual. A water main break had closed the fancy restaurant down the street, sending their customers looking for alternatives. Tessa worked double time, taking orders, serving food, and cleaning tables in a constant rush. During a brief break, she overheard 2 businessmen at table 6 talking about a local restaurant chain that had recently changed ownership. Richardson Industries sold everything off after old man Richardson died, one of them was saying. His son inherited nothing. Word is the kid was too irresponsible to handle the business. Tessa's ears perked up. Richardson wasn't an uncommon name, but given everything Blake had told her about his father's restaurant empire, she wondered if they were talking about the same family. "That's harsh," the other man replied. "Cutting your own son out of the will completely." "Maybe, but Richardson built that empire from nothing. He probably didn't want to see it destroyed by someone who wasn't ready for the responsibility." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Tessa couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard. If Blake was part of the Richardson restaurant family, then his situation was even more complicated than she had realized. Losing a father was devastating enough without also losing your inheritance and your identity in the same moment. That night, as Tessa was closing up Romano's, she found herself looking around the small diner with new eyes. The cracked vinyl booths, the flickering neon sign, the old-fashioned cash register that barely worked, it wasn't much, but it was honest work in an honest place. She wondered what Blake thought of places like this, whether he saw them as beneath him or whether he understood that sometimes the smallest places held the biggest hearts. She locked up the restaurant and walked to her car, glancing once more at her apartment building across the street. The parking lot looked normal now, no expensive cars or unconscious millionaires to worry about. Life was back to its regular rhythm of work, worry, and responsibility. But something had changed in those few minutes Tuesday morning when she had found Blake. She felt like she was waiting for something, though she couldn't say what. It was as if meeting him that night at the restaurant and then finding him unconscious had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. As she drove home through the quiet streets, Tessa thought about her grandmother's words. Sometimes kindness comes back in unexpected ways. She hoped that was true, not just for her own sake, but for Blake's. Everyone deserved to have someone care about whether they made it through their darkest moments. She had no way of knowing that her small act of kindness 2 weeks ago had indeed set something in motion, something that would soon change her life in ways she never could have imagined. All she knew was that she couldn't shake the feeling that her story with Blake Richardson wasn't over yet. The call came on a Monday morning while Tessa was getting ready for work. She almost didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number, but something made her pick up at the last second. "Is this Tessa Williams?" asked a formal male voice. "Yes, this is Tessa." "Who's calling?" "This is James Morrison from Morrison, Fletcher and Associates. We're a law firm here in the city. I need to speak with you about a legal matter concerning an inheritance." Tessa's first thought was that something had happened to her grandmother. Her heart started racing as she gripped the phone tighter. "An inheritance? Is my grandmother okay?" "This doesn't concern your grandmother, Miss Williams. This is about the estate of Robert Richardson. You've been named as a beneficiary in his will." The name hit her like a bolt of lightning. Richardson. Blake's last name was Richardson, and he had mentioned his father's death. But this had to be some kind of mistake. "I think you have the wrong person," Tessa said slowly. "I don't know anyone named Robert Richardson. You may have known his son, Blake Richardson. According to our records, you had a significant interaction with him approximately 2 weeks before Mr. Richardson's death 3 months ago." Tessa's mind reeled. Blake's father had died 3 months ago, which meant their conversation at Romano's had happened just weeks before his death. But why would a man she had never met leave her anything in his will? "I don't understand," she said. "I only met Blake once. I never met his father. There has to be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Miss Williams. I have all the documentation here. Mr. Richardson was very specific about his wishes. Can you come to my office this afternoon to discuss the details? I have to work. I can't just leave my job to, Miss Williams, this is regarding a significant inheritance. I strongly recommend you make time for this meeting." Something in the lawyer's tone made Tessa realize this wasn't a conversation she could dismiss. "How significant?" "I'd prefer to discuss the details in person. Can you be here at 2 o'clock? Tessa looked at her work uniform hanging on the door, then at her reflection in the mirror. Whatever this was about, it was serious enough that a fancy law firm was calling her. "Yes, I can be there." After getting the address and hanging up, Tessa sat on her bed trying to process what had just happened. Blake's father, a man she had never met, had left her something in his will. It didn't make sense unless Blake had told his father about that night at Romano's. About how she had helped him get home safely and treated him with kindness when he was at his lowest point. But even if he had mentioned her, why would that be enough for his father to include her in his will? Tessa called in sick to Romano's, something she rarely did. Her manager wasn't happy, but she promised to make up the shift later in the week. Then she spent 2 hours trying to figure out what to wear to a law office. Her wardrobe consisted mainly of work uniforms and casual clothes. Finally, she settled on her one good dress, the black one she wore to church and job interviews. The law office was in the financial district, in a gleaming high-rise that made Tessa feel out of place before she even walked through the door. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor made her stomach flutter with nerves. James Morrison turned out to be a distinguished man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office overlooked the city, and Tessa could see Romano's diner far below, a tiny speck in the urban landscape. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Morrison said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his massive oak desk. "Can I get you some coffee or water?" "Water would be good," Tessa said, her mouth suddenly dry. While his assistant brought her a glass of water, Mr. Morrison opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. "Miss Williams, I want to start by saying that what I'm about to tell you is quite unusual. In 40 years of practicing law, I've rarely seen anything quite like this." Tessa's hands trembled slightly as she took a sip of water. "Okay. Robert Richardson was a successful businessman who built a restaurant empire from the ground up. When he died 3 months ago, he left very specific instructions about his estate. The bulk of his wealth went to various charities, as you may have heard." Blake mentioned something about that. Yes, Mr. Blake Richardson was quite upset about his father's decision. However, there was one business property that Mr. Richardson handled differently. Mr. Morrison pulled out a deed and placed it in front of Tessa. "He left Romano's diner to you." Tessa stared at the document, the words swimming before her eyes. "He left me what?" "Romano's diner. The restaurant where you work. Mr. Richardson purchased it 6 months before his death, apparently after his son told him about an interaction he had there with a waitress who showed him unexpected kindness." The room seemed to spin around Tessa. She gripped the arms of her chair, trying to process what she was hearing. Blake's father bought Romano's. When? 6 months ago. He bought it from the previous owner but kept the management and staff in place. According to his instructions, he wanted to observe how the business was run before making any changes. But why would he leave it to me? I'm just a waitress there. I don't know anything about running a restaurant. Mr. Morrison smiled gently. According to his letter of instruction, which I'm authorized to read to you, he said, Miss Williams showed my son compassion when he needed it most, treating him as a human being deserving of care rather than judgment. Such kindness is rare in this world and should be rewarded. I believe she will treat this business and its employees with the same care she showed my son. Tears welled up in Tessa's eyes. A man she had never met had watched her work, had heard about her kindness to his son, and had decided she deserved a chance at something bigger than the life she was living. There are conditions, of course, Mr. Morrison continued. You must operate the restaurant for a minimum of 1 year. If you sell or abandon it before then, ownership reverts to the Richardson estate and the property will be sold. I don't understand any of this, Tessa whispered. I don't have money to run a restaurant. I don't know about licenses and permits and suppliers, and the restaurant is debt-free and has enough operating capital to run for 6 months. After that, it will need to support itself. Mr. Richardson also arranged for you to have access to business consulting services if you need them. Tessa looked down at the deed in her hands. Her name was typed in official legal language as the new owner of Romano's Diner. The place where she had worked for 2 years, struggling to make ends meet, was now hers. What happens if I say no? She asked. Then the property goes back to the estate and will be sold to the highest bidder. The current employees would likely lose their jobs. Tessa thought about Rita, who had worked at Romano's for 15 years. About Manuel in the kitchen, who had 3 kids to support. About all the regular customers who depended on the diner for their morning coffee and afternoon meals. Can I have some time to think about this? Of course. But I'll need your answer within a week. There are legal deadlines we have to meet. As Tessa left the law office with copies of all the documents, her mind was racing. In the span of 1 hour, her entire life had changed. She went from being a struggling waitress to the owner of a restaurant, all because she had been kind to a broken man on one difficult night. Walking back to her car, she looked up at the gleaming tower where Blake's father had built his empire. Somewhere in this city, Blake was probably still recovering from whatever had happened to him last week. Did he know about his father's decision to give her Romano's? Did he understand that his moment of vulnerability with a stranger had led to this incredible gift? As she drove home, Tessa realized that her simple life of work and worry had just become infinitely more complicated. She was about to become responsible not just for her own survival, but for the livelihoods of everyone who worked at Romano's. The scared part of her wanted to walk away from this overwhelming responsibility. But the part of her that had grown up watching her grandmother work multiple jobs to keep their family afloat knew this was the opportunity of a lifetime. She just hoped she was strong enough to live up to Robert Richardson's faith in her. Tessa spent the next 3 days in a daze, the legal documents from Mr. Morrison's office spread across her kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve. She read through the deed, the business licenses, the employee contracts, and the financial statements until her eyes burned, but the reality still felt impossible. She owned Romano's Diner. The restaurant where she had worked for 2 years, earning barely enough to cover her rent and her grandmother's medical expenses, now belonged to her. According to the financial statements, it was worth over $400,000, debt-free, with enough money in the business account to cover 6 months of operating expenses. Wednesday evening, she finally worked up the courage to tell her grandmother what had happened. "A man you never met left you a restaurant?" Eleanor repeated, trying to understand. "The same restaurant where you work. His son was the man I told you about. The one I found unconscious in our parking lot last week. I helped him one night when he was drunk and upset about his father's death. Apparently, he told his father about it, and his father decided to leave me Romano's." Eleanor shook her head in amazement. "That's the most incredible thing I've ever heard. What are you going to do?" "I don't know, Grandma. I don't know anything about running a business. What if I mess it up? What if I lose everyone's jobs? Or what if you succeed? What if this is exactly the opportunity you've been praying for?" Tessa had been praying for a way to improve their situation, to stop living paycheck to paycheck, to maybe even save enough money to go back to school. But she had never imagined anything like this. Thursday morning, she walked into Romano's for her regular shift, looking around with new eyes. Every detail seemed different now that she knew she was the owner. The cracked vinyl in booth 3 that she had always meant to report to management. The coffee machine that sometimes made strange noises. The delivery entrance where Manuel struggled with heavy boxes because the ramp was too steep. These weren't just problems for someone else to solve anymore. They were her problems. "You seem distracted again," Rita observed during the morning rush. "This is becoming a pattern with you." Tessa realized she had to tell her coworkers the truth. They deserved to know their jobs were secure and that she was committed to keeping Romano's running. But she also knew the news would change everything between them. During the lunch lull, she gathered Rita and Manuel together in the back booth. "I need to tell you both something important," she began, her heart racing. "It's about Romano's." They looked at her expectantly, probably thinking she was about to announce she was quitting or getting married or moving away. "I own it now," she said simply. Rita blinked. "You own what now?" "Romano's. The restaurant. As of Monday, I'm the legal owner." Manuel dropped his dish rag. "How is that possible?" Tessa explained about Blake, about his father's death, about the inheritance that made no sense but was completely legal and binding. She showed them copies of the deed and the business documents. "So you're our boss now?" Rita asked, still trying to process the information. "I guess I am. But I don't want anything to change between us. You both know this place better than I do. I'm going to need your help to figure out how to run it properly." "Does this mean we're getting raises?" Manuel asked with a grin. "Let me figure out the finances first," Tessa laughed, feeling some of the tension break. "But I promise no one's losing their job. That's the most important thing." Over the next few days, Tessa threw herself into learning everything she could about restaurant management. She studied the supplier contracts, the health department regulations, the payroll system, and the profit and loss statements from the past year. Romano's was profitable, but barely. There wasn't much room for error. She also discovered that Blake's father had been keeping a close eye on the restaurant for months before his death. There were notes in his handwriting about needed repairs, suggestions for menu improvements, and observations about customer patterns. He had clearly intended to make changes to help Romano succeed. One note in particular caught her attention: staff shows genuine care for customers and each other. Rare quality in food service. This is the foundation to build on. Friday afternoon, as Tessa was going through paperwork in the small office behind the kitchen, the bell above the front door chimed. She looked up to see a familiar figure walking in, and her heart nearly stopped. Blake Richardson stood in the doorway, looking around Romano's like he was seeing it for the first time. He appeared much healthier than the last time she had seen him, unconscious in his car. His color was back to normal, his expensive clothes were perfectly neat, and his dark hair was styled properly. But his eyes still held that same vulnerability she remembered from the night she had helped him. He spotted her through the office doorway and walked over slowly, as if he wasn't sure of his welcome. "Tessa," he said quietly. "I was hoping you'd be here." "Blake. You look much better than the last time I saw you." "About that." He ran a hand through his hair, looking embarrassed. "I owe you an explanation. And an apology. You don't owe me anything. I'm just glad you're okay." "What happened that morning?" "Exhaustion, dehydration, and probably too much grief medication mixed with alcohol. I'd been having panic attacks since my father's funeral, and that night was particularly bad. I drove around for hours, not really knowing where I was going, and somehow ended up at your apartment building." "How did you know where I lived?" Blake looked even more embarrassed. "I had a private investigator find your address. After you helped me that night at Romano's, I couldn't stop thinking about your kindness. I wanted to thank you properly, maybe take you to dinner or something. But then I chickened out. So you drove to my apartment building instead? I was going to leave you a note, maybe some flowers. But I had another panic attack in the car and passed out before I could do anything. When I woke up in the hospital, I was mortified that you had found me like that." Tessa studied his face, seeing the genuine regret there. "You scared me. I thought you might be dying. I'm sorry. I never meant for any of that to happen." Blake looked around the restaurant again. "I also need to talk to you about Romano's. So you know. My father's lawyer told me yesterday. I had no idea he had bought this place, or that he planned to leave it to you. Are you angry about it?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "At first, I was shocked. Then I was confused. But angry? No. If anyone deserves a chance at something good, it's you. I don't know if I can do this, Blake. Running a restaurant is completely different from waiting tables. My father wouldn't have left it to you if he didn't believe you could handle it. He was an excellent judge of character." They stood there looking at each other, both understanding that this inheritance had connected their lives in a way neither of them had expected. The restaurant hummed around them with the comfortable sounds of afternoon customers, coffee brewing, and quiet conversation. "Can I help?" Blake asked suddenly. "Help with what?" "With Romano's. I grew up in the restaurant business. I know suppliers, health inspectors, marketing strategies. I could teach you what you need to know." Tessa felt a flutter of hope mixed with caution. "Why would you want to do that?" "Because you saved my life twice now. Once that night when you kept me from driving drunk, and once last week when you found me and called for help. Maybe this is my chance to return the favor." Looking into Blake's earnest eyes, Tessa made a decision that would change everything. "Okay. But I'm the owner, which means I make the final decisions." Blake smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it reached his eyes. "Yes, ma'am. The boss is always right." As they talked about schedules and planning meetings, Tessa felt something shift inside her. The overwhelming fear of failure was still there, but now it was balanced by excitement and possibility. Maybe she could do this after all. And maybe, just maybe, Blake Richardson was exactly the partner she needed to make it work. The first sign of trouble came disguised as a routine health inspection on a busy Thursday morning. Tessa was still learning to balance her new role as owner with her old role as waitress when Inspector Martinez walked through the door with his clipboard and serious expression. "Health Department," he announced. "I need to speak with the owner." Tessa's stomach dropped. She had been dreading this moment since taking over Romano's 2 weeks ago. "That's me. Tessa Williams." Inspector Martinez looked surprised. "You're awfully young to own a place like this. Where's the previous owner?" "He passed away. I inherited the restaurant." For the next 2 hours, Inspector Martinez went through Romano's with a fine-tooth comb. He found violations Tessa didn't even know existed. The hand-washing sink in the kitchen was 2 inches too close to the food prep area, the walk-in cooler temperature log hadn't been updated in 3 days, and the grease trap outside needed professional cleaning. "I'm writing you up for 12 violations," he said, handing her a thick stack of papers. "You have 30 days to correct all of these or I'll have to shut you down." After he left, Tessa sat in the office staring at the violation notices, trying not to cry. Each fix would cost money she didn't have, and some of them required hiring licensed contractors. "How bad is it?" Rita asked, bringing her a cup of coffee. "Bad. Really bad." Tessa showed her the list. "Moving the hand-washing sink alone will cost thousands of dollars." The old owner never had problems with health inspections. The old owner sold the place 6 months ago. Blake's father bought it but kept everything the same. Maybe he was planning to make these improvements before he died. That afternoon, Blake arrived for their scheduled meeting about supplier contracts. One look at Tessa's face told him something was wrong. "What happened?" She handed him the health inspection report without saying a word. Blake read through it, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is targeted," he said finally. "What do you mean?" "I mean someone specifically asked for an intensive inspection of this place. These violations aren't things that developed overnight. They've been here for months, maybe years. But nobody complained before now." "Who would do that?" Blake was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with something. "There's something I didn't tell you about my father's will. Something the lawyer probably should have mentioned." Tessa's heart sank. "What kind of something?" "My father didn't just leave you Romano's. He left you the responsibility of keeping it successful for 1 full year. If the restaurant fails or gets shut down during that time, ownership reverts to his estate. And then what happens? Then it gets sold to the highest bidder. There are already 3 offers on file, all from development companies who want to tear it down and build condos." The room seemed to spin around Tessa. "So if I can't fix these violations in 30 days, I lose Romano's?" "Not necessarily. But it makes things much more complicated." Blake ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his way of dealing with stress. "There's more. My father's business partner, Richard Hartwell, has been trying to buy this property for 2 years. He wants to put a high-end restaurant here. Let me guess. Richard Hartwell has connections at the health department. His brother-in-law is the district supervisor." Tessa felt like she was drowning. In the space of a few weeks, she had gone from struggling waitress to restaurant owner to target of what appeared to be a deliberate sabotage campaign. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I hoped it wouldn't matter. I thought if we could get Romano's running smoothly, prove it was profitable, then nobody would have grounds to challenge the will. But now they're manufacturing grounds. It looks that way." That evening, Tessa sat in her apartment with the health violations spread across her kitchen table, trying to calculate how much the repairs would cost. Even with the money Robert Richardson had left in the business account, she was looking at expenses that would eat up most of her operating capital. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Blake's name. "I've been thinking about the inspection," he said without preamble. "I want to pay for the repairs." "Absolutely not. Tessa, this isn't charity. This is me taking responsibility for a situation my family created. Your family gave me an incredible gift. I'm not taking money from you too. Then consider it a business loan. You can pay me back when Romano's is profitable." Tessa was quiet for a long moment. Pride warred with practicality in her mind. She needed the money, but accepting it from Blake felt like admitting she couldn't handle the responsibility she had been given. "There's something else," Blake continued. "I found out who requested the inspection. It was an anonymous complaint filed 3 days after you officially took ownership." 3 days? Someone was watching that closely. "Richard Hartwell has been waiting for an excuse to challenge my father's will. He thinks Romano should have been part of the business assets that went to charity, not given to a stranger. Maybe he's right. Maybe I don't deserve this place." "Don't you dare say that." Blake's voice was fierce. "My father was the smartest businessman I knew. He didn't make decisions lightly. If he left you Romano's, it's because he saw something in you that made him believe you could succeed. But what if I can't? What if I'm just a waitress who got lucky and I'm in way over my head? Then you learn. And you fight. And you prove that kindness and determination matter more than money and connections." After they hung up, Tessa walked to her window and looked down at the street where she had found Blake unconscious in his car. Everything that had happened since that morning felt like a test she wasn't sure she was prepared to pass. But as she thought about Rita, who had worked at Romano's for 15 years, and Manuel, who supported 3 kids with his kitchen job, and all the regular customers who depended on the diner for their daily routines, she felt her resolve strengthening. Richard Hartwell and his health department connections wanted a fight. She would give them one. The scared waitress part of her wanted to walk away and let them have Romano's. But the granddaughter of Eleanor Williams, who had never backed down from a challenge in her 83 years, was ready to stand and fight for what was hers. She picked up her phone and called Blake back. "I'll take the loan," she said. "But I want it in writing, with interest and a payment schedule. This is going to be a real business partnership, not charity." "Deal," Blake said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Partners?" "Partners," she agreed, and felt the first spark of hope she'd had since Inspector Martinez walked through her door. Tomorrow, they would start fighting back. The next morning, Blake arrived at Romano's before the breakfast rush with a contractor, an industrial cleaning crew, and enough determination to move mountains. Tessa watched through the office window as he directed the workers with the confidence of someone who had grown up in the restaurant business. "He's taking charge," Rita observed, refilling the coffee station. "You sure you trust him?" It was a fair question. Tessa had known Blake for less than a month, and most of their interactions had involved him being either drunk, unconscious, or delivering life-changing news. But watching him coordinate repairs with practiced efficiency, she felt her instincts telling her he was exactly what Romano's needed. "I think so," she said. "But I guess we'll find out." By noon, the contractors had relocated the hand-washing sink, the cleaning crew had scrubbed the grease trap until it sparkled, and Blake was helping Manuel reorganize the walk-in cooler to meet health department standards. He worked with his sleeves rolled up and his expensive shirt getting dirty, completely focused on the task at hand. During the lunch lull, Tessa found him outside checking the delivery entrance that needed to be widened to meet accessibility requirements. "You didn't have to do all this yourself," she said. "I could have managed the contractors." "I know. But I needed to do it." Blake wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "This is the first time in months I've felt useful." "What do you mean?" Blake leaned against the building wall, suddenly looking tired. "Can we sit down somewhere? There are things I need to tell you about why I was such a mess when we met." They found a quiet booth in the corner, away from the few afternoon customers. Blake ordered coffee but didn't touch it, instead staring out the window like he was gathering courage for a difficult conversation. "My father and I had a complicated relationship," he began. "He built his restaurant empire from nothing, working 18-hour days, sacrificing everything for success. He wanted me to be the same way, but I was more interested in having fun than building a legacy. That doesn't sound unusual for someone your age. Maybe not. But it meant we fought constantly. Every conversation turned into an argument about responsibility and wasted potential. The last time I saw him, we had a terrible fight about money I had borrowed to invest in a nightclub that failed." Tessa could hear the pain in his voice. "What did you fight about?" "He said I was selfish and irresponsible. That I cared more about impressing my friends than building something meaningful. I told him his money wasn't worth putting up with his constant criticism." Blake's voice cracked slightly. "I said I didn't need him or his restaurants or his approval." "Oh, Blake." 3 days later, he had a heart attack at his office. Died instantly. "The last words I ever said to my father were that I didn't need him." They sat in silence for a moment while Tessa processed what he had told her. She thought about her own relationship with her grandmother, how they sometimes disagreed but always made sure to end their conversations with, "I love you. That's why you were drinking so heavily that night." That, and I had just found out about the will. Everything went to charity except for a few small properties. At first, I thought it was his final judgment on my character. Proof that he really believed I was worthless. But then you learned about Romano's. Blake nodded. "When the lawyer told me he had left this place to you, I didn't understand at first. Then I remembered telling him about that night, about how a waitress had treated me with more kindness than I deserved." "What exactly did you tell him?" "Everything. How you listened when I talked about losing him, how you made sure I got home safely instead of letting me drive drunk. How you treated me like a person instead of just another customer." Blake looked directly at her. "I told him you were the kind of person who made the world better just by being in it." Tessa felt tears welling up in her eyes. "And he decided to give me Romano's based on that?" "He called me the next day and asked more questions. About you, about the restaurant, about whether I thought you had what it took to run a business. I told him you were smart and kind and hardworking, and that anyone who cared that much about a stranger probably cared about everything they did. So in a way, you recommended me for this inheritance." "I guess I did. But I never expected him to actually do it." Blake reached across the table and touched her hand gently. "The more I think about it, though, the more I realize it was exactly the kind of thing he would do. He always said the restaurant business was about taking care of people, and you're the best at that of anyone I've ever met. Even though I don't know anything about profit margins or supplier contracts. Those things can be learned. Caring about people is something you either have or you don't. You have it." As they talked, Tessa began to understand that Blake's offer to help wasn't just about gratitude or guilt. It was about finding a way to honor his father's memory by helping make his final gift successful. "There's something else I need to tell you," Blake said. "About why I ended up unconscious in your parking lot that morning. The panic attacks you mentioned. It was more than that. I had been drinking every night since the funeral, trying to numb the guilt and grief. That night was the worst it had ever been. I was having thoughts about." He paused, struggling with the words. "About whether anyone would even notice if I wasn't around anymore." Tessa's heart clenched. "Blake. I drove around for hours, not really conscious of where I was going. When I ended up at your building, I think part of me was hoping you would find me. That someone who had been kind to me once might care enough to help again. You could have just knocked on my door. I was too ashamed. Too afraid you would see me as pathetic." Blake managed a small smile. "But you found me anyway. And you called for help instead of just walking away." "Of course I did. Not everyone would have. A lot of people would have figured it wasn't their problem. Tessa thought about that morning, how her first instinct had been to help rather than avoid getting involved. It hadn't occurred to her to do anything else. The hospital psychiatrist said I needed to find something to focus on besides my grief and guilt. Something that would give me a sense of purpose. Blake gestured around Romano's. This place, helping you succeed, it's given me that purpose. So we're both learning as we go. Together, Blake agreed. Looking at him across the table, Tessa realized their partnership was about more than just saving Romano's. They were both trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of loss and uncertainty. His father's gift had given them a chance to create something good together. Okay, partner, she said, extending her hand across the table. Let's save this place. Blake shook her hand, his grip firm and warm. Let's do it. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting golden light through Romano's windows. The contractors had finished most of their work, the restaurant was cleaner than it had been in years, and for the first time since the health inspection, Tessa felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Whatever challenges Richard Hartwell and his connections threw at them next, she and Blake would face them together. 3 weeks later, Romano's diner was transformed. The health violations had been corrected, the equipment upgraded, and the entire place deep cleaned until it sparkled. Blake had thrown himself into the renovation with an intensity that impressed everyone, including the health inspector who returned for a follow-up visit. Outstanding improvements, Inspector Martinez admitted, checking items off his list. I've never seen such rapid compliance with violation notices. Tessa exchanged a look with Blake, both of them thinking the same thing. Martinez seemed genuinely surprised by their success, which confirmed their suspicion that someone had expected them to fail. All violations cleared, the inspector continued. You should receive your updated health rating within a week. After he left, the Romano's staff celebrated with coffee and the apple pie Manuel had been perfecting. Blake fit in naturally with the group, rolling up his sleeves to help wherever needed and treating everyone with respect regardless of their position. I still can't believe he's a millionaire, Rita whispered to Tessa as they watched Blake help Manuel reorganize the storage room. He acts like regular people. Maybe that's because he is regular people, just with more money. Working closely with Blake every day had shown Tessa sides of him she never would have seen during their brief encounters. He was patient when teaching her about supplier negotiations, creative when brainstorming menu improvements, and surprisingly funny when the stress of running a restaurant got overwhelming. He also worked harder than anyone she had ever met. Blake arrived early every morning and stayed late every evening, learning every aspect of Romano's operations. He washed dishes when they were short-staffed, filled in as a server during busy periods, and even learned to cook basic breakfast items when Manuel needed help. You don't have to do all this, Tessa told him one evening as they balanced the daily receipts together in the office. You're supposed to be teaching me business management, not working as free labor. I like the work, Blake said, not looking up from the calculator. It feels good to build something instead of just spending money. Is that what you used to do? Just spend money? Blake was quiet for a moment. Pretty much. I had a trust fund from my grandfather, so I never had to worry about working. I traveled, bought expensive toys, went to parties. I thought I was living the good life, but really I was just wasting time. What changed? My father's death made me realize how empty my life was. I had never built anything, never contributed anything meaningful to the world. When I lost him, I looked around and realized I had nothing real to show for 30 years of living. Tessa studied his face in the dim light of the office lamp. And now? Now I wake up excited to come here. I have purpose, goals, something to work toward that matters. Blake looked up at her with a smile. I never thanked you properly for giving me that. You don't need to thank me. We're partners. Are we? Blake's voice was soft, and something in his tone made Tessa's heart skip. Sometimes I feel like we're becoming something more than business partners. The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Tessa was aware of how close they were sitting, how Blake's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Over the weeks of working together, she had found herself looking forward to his arrival each morning, missing him when he left each evening. But she was also afraid. Blake came from a world of wealth and privilege that was completely foreign to her. What if his feelings were just gratitude mixed with proximity? What if he got bored with restaurant life and moved on to something else? Blake. She began, not sure what she wanted to say. I know, he said gently. We should focus on the restaurant first. Make sure Romano's is stable before we complicate things. Tessa felt both relieved and disappointed. That's probably smart. Probably. But for the record, working with you these past few weeks has been the best part of my day, every day. Before she could respond, Blake stood up and gathered his papers. I should head home. Early morning tomorrow. After he left, Tessa sat alone in the office, thinking about the conversation and the feelings she was trying so hard to ignore. She was falling for Blake Richardson, despite all her rational reasons not to. He was kind, hardworking, funny, and completely dedicated to making Romano succeed. But she was also the granddaughter of a woman who had taught her to be practical about men and money. Eleanor had always said that love was wonderful, but love with financial security was better. The next morning, Tessa arrived at Romano's to find Blake already there, training a new morning server they had hired to handle the increased breakfast business. Their improvements had attracted new customers, and Romano's was busier than it had been in years. Morning receipts are up 20% from last month, Blake reported, handing her the daily summary. The new menu items are really popular, especially Manuel's breakfast burrito. Any word on the revised health inspection rating? Should hear today. Martinez seemed genuinely impressed with the improvements. They fell into their comfortable routine of working side by side, managing the morning rush, checking inventory, and planning for the lunch crowd. Tessa found herself watching Blake interact with customers, noting how he remembered regular orders and asked about people's families. You're good at this, she told him during a brief lull. At what? The restaurant business. Customer service. Making people feel welcome. Blake looked pleased. My father always said the secret to success in restaurants was making every customer feel like they were visiting family. He sounds like he was a wise man. He was. I just wish I had been smart enough to listen to him while he was alive. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Martinez with an official-looking envelope. Your new health rating, he announced, handing it to Tessa. She opened it with trembling hands, Blake reading over her shoulder. The letter contained Romano's new health inspection grade, A+, the highest possible rating. Congratulations, Inspector Martinez said. This is some of the fastest improvement I've seen in 20 years of inspections. After he left, Tessa and Blake stood in the middle of Romano's, holding the letter that proved they had successfully met their first major challenge. We did it, Tessa said, still hardly believing it. You did it, Blake corrected. This place succeeds because of your leadership. Our leadership, she corrected back. We're partners, remember? Blake smiled, and this time when he looked at her, Tessa didn't look away. Whatever was growing between them, it was built on something real, mutual respect, shared goals, and the kind of partnership that made both of them stronger. Partners, Blake agreed, but the way he said it suggested he was thinking about much more than business. As the lunch crowd began to arrive, Tessa felt a happiness she hadn't experienced in years. Romano's was thriving, her employees were secure, and she was working alongside someone who made every challenge feel manageable. She just hoped their success would continue when they faced whatever Richard Hartwell threw at them next. The crisis arrived on a Friday morning in the form of a certified letter from the city planning department. Tessa signed for it with a growing sense of dread, her hands shaking as she opened the official envelope. Notice of emergency building inspection, she read aloud to Blake, who had arrived moments earlier with coffee and pastries from the bakery down the street. Blake read over her shoulder, his face growing grim. Structural integrity concerns reported by anonymous complaint. What does that mean? It means someone is claiming Romano. Building is unsafe and needs to be inspected immediately. Tessa's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. If they find violations, they can shut us down while repairs are made. How long would that take? Could be weeks. Maybe months, depending on what they claim is wrong. Blake took the letter and read it more carefully. The inspection is scheduled for Monday morning. 3 days' notice. That's not enough time to prepare for anything major. Tessa slumped into a chair, feeling the weight of impending disaster. Blake, what if this is it? What if they find something that costs more money than we have? We'll figure it out. We always do. But even Blake's confidence couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. They both knew this was another attack from Richard Hartwell, timed perfectly to cause maximum damage. Friday afternoon was too late to hire their own structural engineer for a pre-inspection, and too late to consult with lawyers about their options. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and desperate preparation. Blake contacted every structural engineer in the city, finally finding one willing to do an emergency consultation on Sunday afternoon. The engineer, James Chen, walked through Romano's with a critical eye, checking foundations, load-bearing walls, and electrical systems. The building is 60 years old, but it's solid, he concluded. I don't see any structural issues that would warrant an emergency inspection. Your electrical system was updated 5 years ago, the plumbing is adequate, and the foundation is stable. Then why would someone report structural problems? Tessa asked. Either they're mistaken, or they're hoping the inspector will find minor issues that can be made to sound major. Sunday evening, Tessa and Blake sat in Romano's after closing, trying to prepare for every possible scenario. They had documentation ready for all recent repairs, copies of permits for the electrical work, and contact information for contractors who could handle emergency fixes. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together, Blake said, reaching across the table to take her hand. Blake, what if we lose Romano's? What if all this work was for nothing? Then we'll start over somewhere else. But we're not going to lose. My father didn't give you this place so you could fail. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Tessa's mood perfectly. The structural inspector, accompanied by Inspector Martinez and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as a city planning supervisor, arrived at precisely 9 o'clock. I'm Supervisor Williams, the man in the suit announced. We've had reports of serious structural concerns regarding this building. Tessa noticed that his name was Williams, same as hers, but there was no warmth in his introduction. Everything about his manner suggested he was there to find problems, not to ensure safety. For 3 hours, the team went through Romano's with microscopic attention to detail. They measured doorframes, tested electrical outlets, examined load-bearing beams, and checked every pipe and wire they could access. Blake stayed close to Tessa throughout the inspection, offering quiet reassurance when the inspector spent long minutes examining something that looked perfectly normal to her. This support beam has some surface rust, Inspector Williams noted, pointing to a minor discoloration on a beam in the basement. That's purely cosmetic, the structural engineer they had hired whispered to Tessa. No structural significance at all. But Inspector Williams made detailed notes about the rust, photographed it from multiple angles, and spent another 20 minutes examining nearby beams for similar issues. When the inspection finally ended, the team huddled together in the parking lot for nearly an hour, discussing their findings in voices too low for Tessa and Blake to overhear. We'll have our report within 48 hours, Supervisor Williams announced when they finished their discussion. Until then, this establishment remains open pending our findings. After they left, Tessa and Blake sat in the empty restaurant, emotionally drained from 3 hours of watching strangers look for reasons to destroy their livelihood. The rust, Tessa said quietly. They're going to claim the rust is a structural problem. Surface rust on a 60-year-old beam is completely normal, Blake replied. Any reasonable inspector would know that. But we're not dealing with reasonable inspectors, are we? That evening, Blake stayed late to help Tessa prepare for the worst-case scenario. They researched the cost of beam replacement, calculated how long Romanos could survive a temporary closure, and made lists of everything that would need to be done if they were ordered to make unnecessary repairs. "There's something I need to tell you," Blake said as they finished their planning session. "If they order expensive repairs, I want to pay for them." "Blake, we've talked about this. I can't keep taking money from you." "You're not taking it. I'm investing it. Romano's success is important to me too." "Why? Really, why does this place matter so much to you?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Because it's the first thing in my life that's ever been about something bigger than myself. Because working here with you has made me a better person than I was before. And because..." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Because I'm in love with you, and I can't stand the thought of watching you lose something this important." The words hung in the air between them, changing everything. Tessa felt her heart racing as she processed what Blake had just said. "Blake. I know the timing is terrible. I know we're in the middle of a crisis and this is the last thing you need to worry about. But I couldn't keep pretending these feelings don't exist." Before Tessa could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. "Miss Williams? This is Supervisor Williams from the City Planning Department. I'm calling with preliminary results from today's inspection." Tessa's stomach clenched as she answered. "Yes. We've identified several structural concerns that require immediate attention. You'll receive the full report tomorrow, but I wanted to notify you that Romano's Diner will need to cease operations until all violations are corrected." The phone slipped from Tessa's hand as the world seemed to collapse around her. Blake caught the phone and continued the conversation, his voice tight with controlled anger. After he hung up, they sat together in the silence of their failing dream. 12 violations, Blake said quietly. All related to that surface rust and some minor settling in the foundation that's completely normal for a building this age. How much? Estimated repair costs of $75,000. Plus lost revenue during closure, which could be 6 weeks minimum. Tessa put her head in her hands and finally let the tears come. Everything they had worked for, everything Robert Richardson had entrusted to her, was being destroyed by people who cared more about money and development than about the lives and livelihoods of working people. "I'm going to fight this," Blake said fiercely. "I'm going to hire lawyers, structural engineers, anyone who can prove these violations are bogus." "With what money? Even if we win eventually, we'll be closed for months. Rita and Manuel will have to find other jobs. Our customers will go somewhere else. Romano's will be finished. Then we'll rebuild it. Start over." Tessa looked up at him through her tears. "Blake, I can't ask you to spend your money fighting a battle we probably can't win. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Because this place matters, and you matter, and I'm not walking away from either one." As they sat together in the restaurant they were about to lose, Tessa realized that Blake's love confession, devastating as the timing was, had given her something to hold on to in the midst of losing everything else. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The next morning brought reporters. Tessa arrived at Romano's to find news vans parked outside and a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. A young woman with perfectly styled hair thrust a microphone in her face before she could even get out of her car. "Miss Williams, how do you respond to allegations that you've been operating an unsafe restaurant?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Tessa said, pushing through the crowd toward Romano's front door. "City records show Romano's Diner failed a structural inspection yesterday and has been ordered to close immediately. Do you have any comment?" Blake appeared at her side, taking her arm and guiding her through the crowd. "No comment," he said firmly to the reporters. Inside Romano's, Rita and Manuel were waiting with worried expressions and a stack of morning newspapers. "It's on the front page of the business section," Rita said, holding up the paper. "Restaurant heiress accused of safety violations." The headline made Tessa's stomach turn. The article painted her as an inexperienced waitress who had inherited a restaurant she couldn't properly manage, putting customers at risk through negligence and incompetence. "Richard Hartwell is quoted extensively," Blake said, reading over her shoulder. "He's calling for a full investigation into how the inheritance was handled and whether you're qualified to own a food service establishment. He's trying to destroy my reputation so completely that even if we fight the violations and win, nobody will trust Romano's anymore." "That's exactly what he's doing." The phone started ringing, reporters wanting interviews, customers asking if Romano's was really unsafe, suppliers wondering about unpaid invoices. Blake handled most of the calls while Tessa tried to figure out their next steps. At noon, James Morrison, the lawyer who had handled Robert Richardson's will, arrived with a folder full of documents and a grim expression. "I've been reviewing the structural inspection report," he said without preamble. "The violations are technically valid but completely unreasonable. Any competent engineer would classify these as routine maintenance items, not safety hazards. Can we fight it?" "Yes, but it will take months and cost more money than Romano's can afford to be closed. Richard Hartwell is counting on that. What are our options?" Morrison pulled out a legal document. "Richard Hartwell has made an offer to purchase Romano's for fair market value. He's willing to hire all current employees at his new restaurant and drop all legal challenges." Tessa stared at the offer. The amount was generous, enough to pay off all debts, cover the cost of fighting the violations, and leave her with a substantial profit. "If I sell to him, what happens to Romano's?" "He'll tear it down and build an upscale steakhouse. The neighborhood institution that's been here for 60 years will be gone forever." Blake had been quiet during the lawyer's presentation, but now he spoke up. "There's another option. I can buy Romano's from Tessa for the same amount Hartwell is offering, then transfer ownership back to her after we fight the violations and win." "That could work legally," Morrison agreed. "But it would cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and lost revenue." "I don't care about the money." Tessa looked at Blake in amazement. "You would risk your entire inheritance to save Romano's?" "I'd risk everything to save you from losing what rightfully belongs to you." The gesture was so generous, so completely selfless, that Tessa felt her last defenses crumble. This wasn't a wealthy man trying to buy her affection or control her business. This was someone who loved her enough to sacrifice his own financial security to protect her dreams. "I can't let you do that," she said softly. "Why not?" "Because it's too much. Because I can't repay that kind of debt. Because..." She paused, struggling to find words for feelings she had been fighting for weeks. "Because I love you too, and I won't let you bankrupt yourself for my sake." Blake's face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. "You love me? I've been trying not to. You're from a completely different world than me. You're educated and sophisticated and wealthy, and I'm a waitress from a working-class family. You're a restaurant owner and one of the strongest people I've ever met. You're kind and smart and you make me want to be better than I was before I met you. But the money, Blake. The difference in our backgrounds. What happens when the novelty of playing restaurant wears off and you want to go back to your real life?" Blake took her hands in his expression completely serious. "This is my real life. You are my real life. Everything before I met you feels like I was just marking time." Before Tessa could respond, Morrison cleared his throat. "I hate to interrupt, but we need to make a decision about Hartwell's offer. He's given us until 5 o'clock today." Blake turned to the lawyer. "Can you draw up papers for my plan? Purchasing Romano's from Tessa with the understanding that ownership transfers back when the legal issues are resolved. It's risky and expensive, but yes, it can be done." "Then do it." Blake, wait, Tessa said. There's something I need to know first. Are you doing this because you love me, or because you feel guilty about your father's death and think saving Romanos will make up for it? Blake was quiet for a long moment, considering her question carefully. Maybe it started as guilt. But it's not about that anymore. It's about building something good with someone I love. It's about proving that kindness matters more than money or power. And if we lose everything, then we lose it together, and we start over together. Tessa looked around Romanos, at the booths where she had served thousands of meals, at the counter where regular customers sat every morning, at the kitchen where Manuel had perfected his recipes over years of dedicated work. This place had been her livelihood, then her inheritance, and now it was the foundation of something much bigger. Okay, she said finally. Let's do it. Morrison spent the afternoon drawing up papers while Blake called his financial advisor to arrange the purchase funds. Tessa used the time to meet with Rita and Manuel, explaining the situation and assuring them that their jobs were secure regardless of what happened. At 4:30, with half an hour to spare before Hartwell's deadline, Tessa signed papers transferring Romanos to Blake. Then she immediately signed papers giving her the right to purchase it back at the same price when the legal issues were resolved. Technically, I now own Romanos, Blake said as they finished signing documents. But practically, we own it together. Partners, Tessa agreed. Partners in business, Blake said, pulling her into his arms. And partners in everything else, if you'll have me. This time, when Blake kissed her, Tessa didn't hold back. She kissed him with all the love and gratitude and hope she had been trying to suppress for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. I love you, she whispered against his lips. I love you too. And we're going to save Romanos, and we're going to make it the best restaurant in the city. Outside, the reporters were gone and the street had returned to normal. Romanos would be closed for the next several weeks while they fought the violations and made the unnecessary repairs to satisfy the city inspectors. But it would reopen, stronger than before, run by two people who had learned that love and partnership could overcome any obstacle. 6 months later, Romanos' Diner was thriving under the joint ownership of Tessa Williams and Blake Richardson. The violations had been overturned by an independent review board, Richard Hartwell had been censured for filing false complaints, and the restaurant had become a symbol of small business success against corporate pressure. More importantly, Tessa and Blake had built something together that neither could have achieved alone, a partnership based on love, respect, and shared values that made them both stronger than they had ever been apart. On their first anniversary as business partners, Blake proposed to Tessa in the same booth where she had first served him coffee on that difficult night when they were both broken and searching for something better. Marry me, he said simply, holding out a ring that sparkled in the soft light of Romanos' neon sign. Be my partner in everything, forever. Yes, Tessa said, tears of joy streaming down her face. Yes to everything. As they kissed in the restaurant that had brought them together, surrounded by the friends and family who had supported them through every challenge, Tessa thought about how a simple act of kindness had led to the love of her life and the fulfillment of dreams she hadn't even known she could dream. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as ordinary moments. A drunk customer who needed help getting home, an unconscious stranger in a parking lot, a small diner that became the foundation for a love story that proved kindness really did come back in the most unexpected and beautiful ways. Romanos' Diner had given them both a second chance at happiness, and they intended to spend the rest of their lives making the most of it.